It's 2025 and a new year means brand new opportunities. And for a lot of you out there, I know you've been thinking about one thing over the holidays, and that is starting your own business. But you have so many questions like how do I get started? How do I come up with a brand? How do I even sell stuff to people? And what am I even going to sell? Now take a deep breath. Shopify has got you. Shopify makes it simple to create your brand, open for business, and get your first sale. And you can get your store up and running easily with thousands of customizable templates. You don't have to be a coding nerd or a design geek to get this done. All you need to do is drag and drop. Shopify also helps with the details like shipping, taxes, and payments from one single dashboard, so you can focus on the important stuff, like growing your business. Established in 2025 has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/truecrime, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/truecrime to start selling with Shopify today. Shopify.com/truecrime.
I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is The Prosecutor's Legal Briefs.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. I'm Brett, and as most of you know, Alice is still on maternity leave, but fear not, you don't just have to listen to me babble on endlessly. I have a very, very special guest, the multidisciplinary Jess Bettencourt, who is the host of one of the sort of best podcasts out there right now, DNA ID, and we're going to have her on the show to tell us all about her show and about herself. But first, I want to welcome you to the show. Thank you so much for joining me.
You're welcome. Well, I have to admit, I challenged Brett to come up with an adjective for me, and he did that on the fly. So that's pretty impressive.
You know, Alice has been like putting the pressure on me for a long time. So I've gotten better at just sort of like going with it.
Multidisciplinary. I appreciate that. Thank you.
And I think that works because even though your show is called DNA ID, you're not a molecular biologist. I'm not even sure what you would call someone
in DNA. No, I'm not a forensic scientist.
Not a forensic scientist. So, well, tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are and what you do.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me. I started out as a baby podcaster, like many people, having no particular expertise in the subject matter that I ended up covering. I have a law background. I'm a lawyer.
As all the best retired podcasters are. So
I would imagine you would think so. However, I only practiced for 6 years. I practiced corporate law. I had massive law school loans to pay back and wanted to get them paid back. And instead of practicing for as long as I thought I would, I had 3 babies in 4 years, and we moved 7 times. So I took 3 bar exams as we kept moving. And I said, when we got to the 4th state, I was like, I'm out. I'm done.
Makes sense to me.
Yeah.
If I never have to take another bar exam, I'll be perfectly fine with that.
Well, and really only lawyers understand how onerous it can be, right? Like we famously had a partner in my firm who went out to start the California branch of the office and failed the bar. You know, I mean, it's real, right? And I like to get worked up over these things. So I did get worked up and it became a big deal. And by the 4th time, with a couple of kids under my belt, I was like, I'm done. You go to work. I'll stay home with these crazy. So we have 3 little boys. I took many years off to do that. Yeah. They're no longer little. They're all way taller than I am. And, you know, as you do when you are used to being in the working world, eventually the kids didn't need me anymore. I was done doing the room mom thing and I started to get bored. And it was around this time I dabbled in some stuff. You know, I worked for Quimby. I don't know if do you know who Quimby is? Have you heard of them? So law students now have this. We didn't have this. It's a company that basically helps law students study, right? With little like short South Park like videos of like Plessy v. Ferguson, right?
Okay.
I mean, which I wrote that one.
Okay.
Anyway, so it was a good job to have for a little while, but eventually they fired me. They ran out of funding or something. So around that time was right after Serial had come out. And I've always been a true crime junkie, literally since I was little. I mean, I called the FBI and asked if I could join when I was in my laundry room at the time. I had like 2 kids. And I'm like, is it too late for me? And they're pretty much like,
Yeah.
it's too late. You gotta anyway. So no FBI for me, but I was always a sort of a wannabe. And, it's sort of cliche, but I read all this stuff when I was a kid, Nancy Drew and all that crap. And I was like religiously glued to Quincy MD and Barnaby Jones and all those old shows. So Serial came along, loved that. And then I started listening, like many of us did, to all these podcasts that, emerged. And I listened to one it's hosted by the woman now who hosts Crime Lines, Charlie, but it was called Insight back then. And she had a co-host. And they had on their website, we're looking for research help, right? If you want to help out. And I was like, I can do that. I can do this stuff in my sleep. So, because obviously with law school, there's not something, to do is research, right?
Right.
So started working for them. They paid me, as much as they could. That wasn't even the point. The point was I was contributing. And then they're like, well, can you write? I'm like, yeah, I can write. One thing I forgot to mention is my parents are both journalists. My dad worked for the Washington Post for 33 years.
Oh, wow.
He traveled with Madeleine Albright and, the whole thing. And my mom worked for the Voice of America as a Europe editor. So journalism in the family, I was an English major, law school, true crime junkie. It all kind of converges, right? So there we are. I was working for Insight, and then I pitched to a couple shows. I won't name them, but I basically sent a script I had written with permission from Insight and said, this is what I can do. And since that was early 2018, I've been working for True Crime Garage as a ghostwriter for some of their episodes. And I know you know those guys.
Oh, I love those guys. Are we supposed to keep that a secret? Do I need to edit that?
No. It's out now. I mean, Nick in particular is, he just has been amazing in the true crime world. I mean, a podcasting world.
I was about to ask, how do you write for the captain?
I don't write for the captain. That is not my bit. But you know how Nick is like deadpan when the captain says something? I'm the deadpan part. I can just keep going. Yeah. Working for Nick has been great because he's connected me to a lot of people. Through him, I met Bill Thomas, who is the Colonial Parkways brother, who's an advocate for that. And he connected me with Mike Morford, who do you know Mike?
Another great guy. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So Mike and I became partners essentially.
Okay.
And we partnered up on a show called Missing Persons, which I now host. And it's a dual show. So I sort of do a backstory and then he interviews a family member of a missing person. And that show's really had some interesting episodes. And then we collaborated on a series called Scene of the Crime, which was about the Delphi case. So we have 7 episodes. And you know who else was a partner in that was Gray Hughes. I don't know if you've encountered him at all, but
I have.
Of YouTube fame. Yeah. So anyway, so we did Scene of the Crime, Delphi, 7 episodes on that. And that got some traction because that case, it was long before Richard Allen was arrested, obviously. And that case, I mean, I feel like that case, in a way that the Idaho murders has now done, right? Delphi captured everyone's attention. I mean,
100%.
Yeah.
That was probably the first big case that we did where we covered that case, and it was relatively new podcast and we had a pretty healthy audience, but we covered that case and it was incredible the number of people who wanted information on that case. I mean, the attention on it, and I think, as we've always said, every victim deserves justice, but it's hard to think of more sympathetic victims than the 2 victims in that case. And everybody wanted to figure out the truth about what happened. So it's not surprising that did get so much traction.
Well, and we still don't know the truth, right? I mean, and famously in our 7 episodes, we said categorically, because the police said this, these girls were not catfished, right? I mean, they were not lured to the bridge by but then look what happened. Oh, maybe they were catfished, right? So we still don't know what the connection is with Richard Allen and this other guy that was on, talking to Libby and eventually, obviously, hopefully we will find all that out. But that case really, one thing I'd like to talk about in these kind of settings is the cases that capture the attention of people. It's really hard to put your finger on why, right? I mean, that case, there are kids murdered all over the country every day, right? But that case really, I mean, international attention to that case. People are glued to it. And I think you're right, sympathetic victims, but there are many, as I said.
No, now that you're absolutely, I mean, that's a fascinating topic. I could spend a lot of time on that. And it just a very simple example of that, a case we covered maybe 6 months later is Evansdale. Very similar case.
Yeah.
2 young girls.
Almost. Yeah.
out on a beautiful day, riding their bikes. They are apparently kidnapped by some stranger and taken off and murdered, and their bodies are found in the woods. The only thing you're missing really is the video. And the video obviously was a powerful piece of evidence that really grabbed people, because it was just like, how can we, there he is. He's right there. That's the guy who did it.
Yeah.
And we can't find him. So, I mean, maybe that's it, but you're right. I mean, there are obviously characteristics you can look at, and people have debated this and argued about it until the end of time. But there's also a mystery to it, like a mysterious quality about what it is about a particular, like the Gabby Petito case.
Yeah.
When I first heard about that, I didn't think it would become what it became. I didn't think people would become as obsessed with it as they did. And yet you talk about a case that just dominated true crime and beyond true crime. Like you said, international headlines, CNN. I mean, it was everywhere. And it is hard to say why. The Idaho murders are pretty obvious, but it's weird why certain cases grab people the way it does.
Yeah, because Evansdale really should have gotten the attention. I think you must be right. It must be the video, right? Because it's so flummoxing that they have the guy on video. Like, he should, why can't we? And it's a similar one. I can't remember her name right now, but the woman who was murdered in the church in Texas, with the SWAT
you
guy.
hadn't said that, I would absolutely know. Yeah. Right. Oh, God. Yeah, exactly. And there's a video
two senior moments
of the guy wandering around the church. And it's like, how is it possible that we covered that case and basically came to the conclusion it had to be a stranger, because if it was anybody that people knew, surely someone would have recognized this person. But I know exactly, I know, once again, I can't remember the name, but I know exactly the case you're talking about.
Right. And everyone thought, oh, maybe it's a woman. It walks like a woman, or it walks like that. Then there was that suspicious gait. Anyway, people fixate on these things, and it's hard to know why. Right. So anyway, long story short, I'm getting back around to my point, which is that, so I was working for True Crime Garage. I was doing missing persons, and COVID hit, right? And GSK was solved in April of 2018. And after that, we sort of saw this like upswing of cases that it started to be like a flurry almost of cases that were solved using this forensic genealogy, right? And it got to the point that I was hearing about them on a regular, weekly, if not more than that basis. So-and-so declared the murderer of X victim in 1980. He's dead. And next on News at 6, something else. You know what I mean? And they would kind of gloss over it, right? Because it was, the answer was out there. We had the name. The victim got justice, by having the name out there of the killer. And that was it. So after a few of these, I found myself saying, geez, well, there's more to these stories, right? I mean, someone's been following these cases for 40, 50 years. There's got to be more to it. So I kept saying, well, somebody should do a podcast on this. I mean, hello, Mike, Nick, anybody? Like, somebody do a podcast. Because, that really wasn't my big thing. I don't love being in the front and center. I don't love my voice. I don't love all this stuff. So, but anyway, no one did it.
And so it fell to you.
I said, well, I guess I'll do it. Yeah.
Well,
so here we are.
I will say this. I regularly, whenever I see people ask for recommendations, and as you know, if there's anything people who listen to podcasts love to do, it's ask for recommendations. Yeah. Whenever I see that, I always see your podcast come up. And I think it really has, we talked about why is it that certain things grab people in the way they do. There's obviously a lot of podcasts out there, many podcasts, and there's a ton of true crime podcasts. But I think people are so fascinated by the DNA aspect. And in some ways, it almost feels like magic, because like you said, you have cases that have, the boy in the box case, right? Out of Pennsylvania, I think Philadelphia.
Yeah. Philly.
Case that really had just stuck with people in that community, people across the country for decades. And you just never thought that case would be solved, ever.
Never.
And then all of a sudden you get the news that it has been solved. We know who he is now, and it's almost miraculous that you can do that. So I guess, so that's how you got started with tell us a little bit about the show and sort of, for people who haven't heard it, who need to go listen, tell us a little bit about how you decide, like what cases you're going to cover and how you break it down.
Okay. Well, so the way I decide what cases to cover is I have to have access to information, right? So I don't start with a Google search. I mean, that's, eventually when the case is, when the authorities announce the case is resolved or is moving to the next step, then I have, there's a public announcement. Then I submitted a public records request. That's the first step, because I have to have access to the case files. or at least an executive summary of the case files, because I need to know what actually happened. And that was really the gist of why I started this podcast, is because, the sort of 30-second soundbite that you got when the case was closed didn't really answer any of my questions, right? I'm like, well, wait a minute. So X killed Y, but how did they hook up? Like, what do you mean? Why wasn't this solved for 40 years? Like, how did they not know he was the neighbor or whatever? So, those are all the questions that I found myself asking. And so now if I can get case documents, I can get the closing detective to talk to me, or somebody, in charge to talk to me and answer my questions, of which there are usually many, then I will cover the case. Now, that being said, those are for the cases where the guy's dead, right? If it has to be adjudicated and we're seeing more and more of those now, right? Because as forensic genealogy matures, we've had more and more arrests, and the cases are wound their way through the legal system now, finally. Because as you know, it takes years, especially with COVID, right? So in the beginning, most of my guys that I could cover were dead because the police could talk to me. They could release information because the case was resolved. Now these guys are getting tried, and those cases are getting resolved. So I have trial documents. The DAs will talk to me once the guy's put away and the appeals period is run or whatever. So that's how I decide what cases to cover.
Let me ask you this, and this is probably the thing that only interests me. I feel like we always have all these cases in the back burner that we want to cover, and usually we're sort of gathering information. And I feel like I send out these records requests and just never hear from anybody. It's like they're like, received, we'll process, and then I never hear anything. How successful have you been with your, and I'm sure it's hit or miss, with getting information from these police departments?
Well, first of all, you're clearly not as much of a pain in the ass as I am, because I will take the note of the records clerk's name who responded to me with her like typical pre-written answer, and I will call her or email her, Hannah, hi, I sent you an email 2 weeks ago requesting documents, and they can't ignore me forever. As they said in the movie, I won't be ignored, Dan. So I will make myself a pain. Look, obviously states like Florida are a dream, right? You literally get online and there's the trial transcript and like all the exhibits. It's crazy. Ohio is great. Michigan has a lot of stuff online. It's state by state. The nemesis states are Montana will give me absolutely nothing. And they will rip up my check in front of my face and send it back. And then there's California, right? Which California is by far and away the leader in the forensic genealogy cases. In fact, they were sort of the instigator, right? Right. So, and that was, they were even looking at it before GSK. And they have an exemption to their public records request laws that's exempt any investigative materials, right? Of
course, yeah.
So they won't give me any of that stuff.
Even when the case is closed,
even when the case is closed. Nope.
Okay.
So what I've done and had to do is basically make friends out there with as many people as I can, right? So I just got back from a conference in California. It was International Homicide Investigators Conference on Forensic Genealogy. Talk to as many people as I can, shake hands, meet the DAs, meet the forensic analysts, meet the detectives, and I have gotten contacts now with quite a few of them. So that is helping, and they'll talk to me because they know I am supporting this endeavor. I'm supporting your work in this area, right? I'm a big supporter of forensic genealogy. I'm encouraging listeners to upload their DNA, and I'm a proponent of what you're doing. So they're not feeling threatened. I'm not coming at them like, you're violating people's privacy. No, I'm fully behind this wonderful tool that we have for, crime solving now. So that's the long answer, but I stick with it. There are some times that I just call the detective. Like, that's kind of a back alley way to do it, but I'll just call the detective and be like, look, I'd love to cover your case. And so many of them are so proud of the work they've done in these cases because they brought a case to fruition after 40 years. 7 detectives retired in front of them, right? And couldn't solve this case because it was unsolvable, because it was a stranger on stranger or whatever, right? Here comes forensic genealogy.
You would have been a great FBI agent. It's the Bureau's loss. There's no question. You'd have been a great journalist too. Your parents are proud, I'm sure. So, it's interesting. Well, number one, multidisciplinary that you are. How did you sort of learn to speak the lingo of forensic genealogy? And, what was the learning curve like there, figuring out exactly how that works and explaining it?
Well, that's a complicated question. In reality, forensic genealogy isn't really that complicated. Genealogists have been doing this work for a couple decades, right? And they started by helping out with adoptees, right? That's really how this all got its start. They had invented autosomal DNA testing kits, family tree DNA, I think, invented it. People started swabbing themselves and sending it in and saying, oh, look, I've got relatives that I didn't know about, right? That's really where this started. And they could use it to look for their birth parents, and search angels help them, and so on. So when they realized that this could be used in crime solving, it's really no different. In other words, you're simply building a family tree. That's really what you're doing, and finding where, I mean, it's a little complicated because you have to find the links, right? Where the parents' generations meet up.
And I want to focus on that for a second, because I think this is something where people are really confused. I think a lot of people think forensic genealogy is you go to Ancestry, which my understanding is they don't even allow access to their database, but you go to the ones who do. And, you put in the DNA and then up pops their father, and then you know who it is because there's the father's DNA. So obviously it's the person, but that's not how it works, right?
That's not how it works. So let's just get this out on the open. There are probably, I don't know, I think they said it's over 20 million individual DNA samples in the databases between Ancestry and 23andMe. Those are the two big ones, right? They are fully private. They are not searchable by law enforcement, anyone working for law enforcement. And in fact, they have both vowed to fight any warrant, would one ever come their way, to produce anything. So those are impenetrable. Okay. However, there are the open source databases, GEDmatch being one, and Family Tree DNA. Okay. Authrim has its own database, which it uses the other two, but it's a building up its own. And then there's a new database called DNA Justice, which is started by CeCe Moore and her team, which basically is purely to provide law enforcement with a resource. Okay. Once you, Brett, take your sample with 23andMe and you send it back to 23andMe, and you can look at your thing and say, oh, look, I've got 200 second cousins. Look, I didn't know I had a cousin Berta in Kansas, whatever. That is not what law enforcement has access to. You would have to actively take your genetic profile, which is 23andMe gives you. It's a little file with a lot of numbers, and upload it to one of those other open source databases. Okay.
So that is a possibility. See, I didn't know that. So that is a possibility. You can do it without doing the swab again. You can send them the information.
Absolutely. I've done my swab once and I'm in 3 different databases. Okay. So it's incredibly easy. Like GEDmatch has instructions. That's the one that I chose to do, has instructions on it, how to upload. CeCe's website, DNA Justice, same thing. Very, very easy. And I think I did offer all 3. It's literally simple. Transfer your data file. Okay. Now, when law enforcement goes to search those, first of all, for GEDmatch, you have to opt in for law enforcement searching. Okay. You have to check a box that says, I agree to have my DNA included in a law enforcement criminal search. If you opt out, your DNA will not come up when they enter that other kit. When they go into and enter a kit, so they have got a sample from, PER, right? Unsub, whatever you want to call them. They've got the sample, they upload it, and they don't get like your name, your address, your genetic code. They're not cloning you. That is not how this works. They simply get a list of the top matches based on the amount of shared DNA and email addresses that the people entered themselves, right? That's it. That's what they get. So if they don't, you don't even have to use your real name. You could upload as, Minnie Mouse and have an email address, and they would say, okay, well, Minnie Mouse shares 1,600 centimorgans with our PER. That's a pretty close relative. We're going to have to track down Minnie Mouse, So they use the email address and they contact Minnie Mouse, and that's how that works. So there's a little bit of misunderstanding about how invasive this whole thing is. They are not getting your personal information. So they get the matches, they build the family trees, they say, okay, we've got, this is likely a second cousin, this is likely a third cousin. They're on different sides of the suspect's tree because they're not related to each other, right? So they build it back and they can find what's called like the ancestral match. And they then do descendancy research to figure out every descendant of that ancestral marriage and what people were the right age in the right place. And those are the suspect pools.
And it's such an interesting combination because you have people who are scientists who know nothing about genealogy, who are working from the DNA side. And then I guess you just have genealogists who have been building family trees, and that's sort of what they do. And you put the two together and you end up building this family tree to try and discover this sort of unknown person. Is that essentially how it works when people are putting this together?
Yeah, it's an interesting time for genealogists, right? Because they've been around forever. I mean, genealogical societies have existed for how long, right? Decades, centuries, really. People have been interested in family histories. And now all of a sudden it's being thrust into the spotlight. And some of the attention they're getting is negative. Well, what are you doing? It's like hocus pocus, and you're naming suspects. And that is not what they are doing. They're not naming suspects. They are providing law enforcement with, look, it could be any one of these guys at this bottom level of the tree who are related to this sample that we got. That's what they're doing. It's the same as your cousin calling in an anonymous tip and saying, Brett's the pervy guy who did that crime down the street.
And that's another thing a lot of people don't understand. I mean, there's a reason that usually the genetic genealogists are not testifying in court, because my understanding, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is essentially, yeah, you're just doing this to get your suspect pool. And then once you have your suspect and who you think it is, and maybe even who you know it is, you can do traditional DNA testing. You can do the CODIS type testing you would always do if you had a suspect. You can get a DNA a sample from the suspect and compare it directly to the DNA sample. So really, the genetic genealogy, it gets you to that point. But when you go to court, the thing that really matters is we have his DNA, and oh, by the way, it matches the crime scene.
Right. And I don't want to get overly complicated, but so we have, I assume that all the listeners understand about the CODIS system, right?
They do.
The combined index DNA system that, we've got the federal level, this individual state levels, and then the individual lab levels, right? So that is completely different DNA than we're talking about. That is the STR DNA, and that is what the FBI decided was the gold standard for comparing DNA, and it contains no genetic information whatsoever. It's literally like in between, and this is where you can tell I'm not a biologist, but it's non-intrusive DNA that single tandem repeats. Everyone has them, and they can tell from the way they diverge who's related, how closely people are related, right? That is not what forensic genealogy is based on. Forensic genealogy is based on these SNP samples, which is a completely different way of looking at the DNA and measuring the DNA. So it is mandated, essentially. Now, that's a whole other problem that none of this is regulated. But when there is no arresting anyone without an STR sample that matches their suspect sample, and you don't do forensic genealogy without running a CODIS test first, right? I mean, first of all, that would be a giant waste of resources, right? But one statistic I heard recently was that about 19% of CODIS searches come up with a hit, right? That's not very many.
No.
But forensic genealogy succeeds. I don't know the percentage of times it succeeds, but I've only heard of one case where they were just like, well, shit, we can't find anybody,
Right. And that's the thing. Even though sort of the major databases aren't there, you still have a large pool to draw from, and the genealogy side of it can do sort of miraculous things. But, you're only in CODIS, really, if you're in it for some sort of weird reason. You voluntarily were in it, or you're in it, as part of some sort of job or whatever, or if you're a victim, or if you're a criminal, right? I mean,
right.
that's the only way you really end up in CODIS. So you would expect that database to be a lot smaller. So when you are trying to compare directly, unless you're one of those people, it's not going to come up. And we see that, you see that a lot. You see more often than you would think. And one thing that it seems like genetic genealogy is confirming is the number of people who commit a murder and then never do it again, which is something people didn't believe happened before. But now we're seeing people who get arrested because of genetic genealogy who will say things like, yeah, I really thought I'd like it and I hated it and I never did it again.
Yeah.
So those people, they're not criminals. I mean, they're murderers, but they're not criminals in the sort of traditional sense. So they're not going to come up in CODIS. I mean, they're just never going to be in there. So you have to have this other tool. One thing I wanted to talk about, and you sort of brought it up, so I'm going to talk about it now. So it's funny because every time I talk to somebody or hear someone speak about genetic genealogy, they always sort of, in a roundabout, evasive, without ever mentioning anybody way, talk about sort of the dark side of genetic genealogy, that there's sort of like a side of genetic genealogy or people who are involved in it who maybe aren't as ethical as they should be. And that's why we need regulation. And do you see that? Or is that sort of an overstated thing? Am I making this up? Is that a problem?
Yeah, I don't see it personally. I mean, listen, we can't confuse the issues that we have with DNA and DNA collection with forensic genealogy, right? So a lot of the court cases that forensic genealogy has resulted in a few leads, the police check the DNA of all those people in the leads and they find the one, right? The guy. They arrest him. Eventually it goes to trial. The forensic genealogy is not on trial there at all. In fact, in the trial, that's all settled in pretrial hearings, because the reality is no one wants to explain this to a jury because it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that they found the guy through his aunt in Skokie. It really does not matter. What matters is they found him and his DNA is a match, like 700 billion match, like whatever the number is, that it's incontrovertible, right? But so the dark side of forensic genealogy, I think people are confusing with they're concerned about their privacy rights. They're concerned that people have access to their genetic data and their insurance companies are going to find out that they're predisposed to diabetes or whatever it is, right? Or that their uncle had some horrible invasive form of cancer that's genetic. That's not how forensic genealogy works. The police cannot see your health information from any of this. They have an email address and a username. However, that's a whole different issue from when the cops are grabbing a surreptitious DNA sample from, say they have three brothers, right? So Parabon comes to them and says, okay, well, it's one of the Smith brothers, A, B, and C, right? So they follow A and they get a coffee cup, and they follow B and they get a cigarette. It's not them. It must be C, right? Well, it's eventually C. But what are they doing with those DNA samples from A and B, right? What happens to those? So that, I think, is a whole nother area that it's kind of unclear, right? I mean, that's a state law issue. Is that going into a database somewhere? Is it getting destroyed? I'm sure people would have a preference which of those two it was, right? Because those guys are innocent and they didn't do it. They were just a lead and it went nowhere.
Right.
So that can get a little touchy, right? You understand how people would say that's a little funky. I don't like that. That's the only dark side I see, and that really is more DNA related. There is also, though, one thing that has been proposed there's all these, this is a whole other area that we don't really need to get into, but this is not regulated. None of this is regulated yet. So 2 states have now passed legislation to sort of not really curb it, although Maryland's law is pretty strict, but to regulate how it's used. And some of them, have requirements about you have to destroy the DNA samples afterward. And one thing that might be beneficial in the long run, I think Utah's new law might have this, is that you don't reveal the matches publicly. I know it's Florida's new law. So Florida has these sunshine laws. Everything's available,
Right.
but the matches are going to be exempt from that, because there's really no need to out the fact that the genealogist found that, whoops, that guy's not your dad, even though you thought he was your dad. That's a misattributed parentage event, right? That is happening so much that it's actually shocking. I'm like, don't people use condoms? I guess not. Anyway, that we digress. But so the point is that anyway, people the matches shouldn't be out there. They're not important. They're literally irrelevant, because what matters is the end result, which is redundant. I know, but the result is what matters. They get the guy and his DNA matches.
So you've covered a ton of these cases on your show. Do you have, for people out there who are listening and I expect are now clamoring to go listen to you, is there a case that you think this is the one you should listen to first to sort of dive into what you do?
Well, I mean, I know you asked me my favorite case. I mean, I've covered 60 of these now. It's funny because I consider them all like my victims, right? Like I've dug into them so much. They're like, every single victim's name is burned on my brain. And I cannot remember the killer names. It's so weird. I'm like, oh wait, who killed her again? Which is, I guess, good because it's all about the victim, right? But I'm like, oh shit, what was the guy's name who killed, whoever? But the Judy Nesbitt case, okay? And I don't remember what episode number it is, but it was in season 2. That case, and it was out of Newport Beach, California. And one of my, I don't want to use the word favorite detectives, I don't want my other detectives to be mad, but one of my favorite detectives. Court Depwig, who is absolutely incredible sergeant in homicide out there, is doing great work. I've worked with him on a couple cases now. And this case was a mother of four, 1980. They were selling the family boat. There was, it was a big boat. It's at the marina in Newport Beach. They're selling it. She gets a phone call. Her son answers the phone and says, Mom, someone wants to buy the boat. She gets on the phone and she says, okay, I'll meet you at 1:00 today. It was like Thanksgiving week, 1980. She goes, meets the buyer on the boat, and her family finds her hours later dead on the boat, shot in the head, her purse ransacked. And the guy had like battened down the boat canvas and buttoned it up and put the padlock back on and walked away. And 40 years, they never could find this guy because, first of all, it's a gunshot, right? So they can find DNA now. They didn't even have DNA back then, but it took a long time to get to the point where we are now, where you can get DNA from like a pinhead, right? Even 10 years ago, you needed a lot of DNA. So this was the first case that they closed where DNA was extracted from a rootless hair. So Estrella Forensics got DNA out of a hair that she had some in her hand, but a couple had fallen on the countertop where he had ransacked her purse. And they think it's because she yanked his hair out of his head and it was still falling as he walked away after shooting her, and he left it there. So they were able to figure out who the guy was and that he was on the boat with her. And it turned out that the original detectives had just missed kind of a glaring clue, and he was in the case file the whole time.
Wow.
Yeah. And that happens very, very rarely. I will say there's maybe, I don't know, 2 or 3, maybe 4 that I've covered where the cops are like, oh crap, they just missed it. That most of these cases, the vast majority there is no way to solve. There's literally no way to solve it because DNA wasn't DNA back then. And there was no connection. A girl was pulled into the bushes literally and raped and killed, right? There's one case, the first one I ever covered, Jody Loomis. She was riding her bike along, guy pulls her into the bushes, rapes her, shoots her in the head. They took a vaginal swab at her autopsy. The guy's like, yep, sperm, she was raped, and he throws it out.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I mean, they didn't know, right?
Right, I know.
So,
still.
I know, it's crazy. It makes you crazy. And then decades later, a lab tech was going through the evidence and noticed a tiny drop of semen on her boot. Literally,
Wow.
the boot that she was lacing up when the guy shot her in the head. And she's like, well, let me see if I can get anything out of this desiccated semen from 40 years ago. Yep. And they arrested the guy. I mean, there is nothing more satisfying than that, right? But again, those kind of cases, it comes down to luck. They still had DNA and evidence from this stranger on stranger crime that would literally never have been solved otherwise.
So you mentioned there's only been a few cases you've covered where the police kind of missed it.
Mm-hmm.
So does that mean that most of the cases you look at, the eventual person who did it isn't even on the police's radar at all? They're not even the suspect. They're just completely is a person. You mentioned the Golden State Killer earlier.
Yeah.
And listening to that book, I'll Be Gone in the Dark.
Yeah.
And they had done so much, Michelle McNamara and the people who were doing that, the community that had grown up around trying to figure out who it was. They had done so much research, and they had spreadsheets out the wazoo, and they had, looked at thousands of possible suspects.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, they caught the guy, and nobody had that guy's name anywhere.
No.
Completely random. Is that usually what you're seeing?
Yeah. And I actually had at this conference I was at, I had lunch with Paul Holes and some other people, and he was saying, I thought GSK was a builder. He seemed to know all these developments like the back of his hand, and there was a connection with some map or something. Anyway, he was like, I was totally wrong. The guy was not on their radar. So the reason that these cases are being solved by forensic genealogy now is because the department, whichever department is funding them and committing the resources, is invested in this case, right? It's not a case that just no one cares about and sort of fell off the radar. It's a case that has been worked to death, detective after detective. And that might be because the family does a good job at staying in their line of sights, or they are frustrated they can't solve it. It seems so solvable, but the vast majority of these, there literally would be no way for them to know, right? Again, there are exceptions, like the Nancy Benalla case, which was until very recently, she was believed to be a Zodiac victim. don't get me started. It was ridiculous, but you know how the Zodiac people are. He killed everybody, right? So he didn't. But anyway, so she was killed by a neighbor in her complex who could see her from his window. He could see into her apartment across the way, right? And somehow when the cops talked to him the next day, somehow they missed it, that he must have had a giant cut on him because he bled everywhere, and that's how they ended up catching or finding him. He was dead by the time they got him. But you know, so that kind of thing is an oversight. His name was in the case file. And when Sergeant Mickey Lynx found it, she told me, she said, like, this has been in here the whole time. But it didn't stand out. He was just a neighbor. There were 27 of them. They were all canvassed. So that's the thing. It flushes out stuff. And that's how they know that the lead is solid, right? They come up with these leads and they're like, okay, there are 3 Smith brothers. They could do it genetically, any one of them, but only one of them lived in Peoria in 1980. Right?
Right.
So that's the next. That's how it works.
Let me ask you this. So we've talked a lot about unsolved cases, and obviously there's enough work to keep people busy forever on unsolved cases. How often are people attempting to apply genetic genealogy to cases that we believe are solved that are either controversial, or maybe there's an accusation of sort of a false conviction, you know, that sort of thing? Do you see that a lot? In the case I'm thinking of is the West Memphis 3. Not that they use genetic genealogy, but it's just an example of a case where you have these sort of bitterly divided camps of they did it or they didn't do it. And people have been fighting over that forever. And sometimes I just wonder if it was just a trucker at the truck stop who went down there, found those 3 kids, killed them, got in his truck and drove off, and nobody ever even knew to look at him, kind of like this situation. Are you seeing a lot of this in those kind of cases, or is it not so much moved over into that yet?
Well, I mean, that is one of the reasons that the proponents of forensic genealogy are so vocal about its powers, because not only does it find the person who did it, right, but it essentially exonerates everybody who was a suspect, right? And several of the cases I've covered, in fact, the one I covered most recently, Roxanne Wood, her husband, Terry, was literally, the police were telling the media, he's our prime suspect. They were like, we just can't nail him, but he did it. We know he did it. And this went on for, 30, 40 years. And it happens over and over again, where I will say one thing I have often said is that the cops get a bad rap, right? We all know the police these days there's I'm not going to even go into that. You know what I'm talking about. But in almost none of these cases have I seen arrests that are bogus, because they just can't, the suspect doesn't mesh up somehow. And they're like, we can't get him. So they don't, right? That's what you want. You want this stuff you want people to say, we have to follow the evidence. And when the forensic genealogy comes out in the end, it says, no, it wasn't the husband, by the way. He was telling the truth. It was a guy who sneaked in the 15 minutes that you weren't home and slit your wife's throat and killed her, And what are the chances? That's why the police didn't believe him. Almost none, right? So I know there was a case out of California, the Jane Hilton case, where there was an exoneration. Forensic genealogy found the real guy, and I think the Innocence Project was involved in that. I know there was a bunch, obviously, where like Henry Lee Lucas and those guys were arrested, but they were let go long before DNA. They were eventually ruled out by DNA, but forensic genealogy wasn't a thing then.
Well, he lied about
but that is
100 different murders. So,
my listeners are so tired. I'm literally at the point where I'm like, okay, here we go again. Henry Lee Lucas. He took credit for it because so many of these cases were unsolved and sitting there, and the detectives were like, well, that guy says he did it. Maybe he did. They're desperate for something, right? So anyway, I think that is one of the strong arguments for forensic genealogy, again, is that it makes it clear that, like, the person who was innocent, really, their life could have been a lot better if they were allowed to grieve their loved one instead of being accused, right? And maligned, and the neighbors turning against them and their friends turning against them, instead of just, we can see they didn't do it. So anyway, so that's just my thoughts on that.
So what do you think's next for genetic genealogy? I assume it's only going to get more effective and pervasive, right? Yeah.
So what's next, I think, is that it's going to go to active cases. And we saw that in the Idaho case, right? Now, and one thing you touched on earlier is that, this doesn't come into court. That forensic genealogy is not something that it shouldn't need to be presented to the jury. They shouldn't have to educate the judge on it. This should all happen by the time this case gets to court, man. This guy better have a STR test that matches up, and you've got him dead to rights with other evidence as well, right? I mean, if you have a DNA, but he's in a different state at the time, that's not going to help you, right? You still need to line everything up. I think cases today that there's sort of been this thing with genealogy where they're like, okay, well, the case has to be cold, you have to have no stone has been unturned, but really, why, right? Why do we have to wait for that? Why do we have to wait for cases to go cold? We don't, and there's no reason, and in fact, it's arguably a waste of resources to run down every alley and interview everyone and interrogate everyone and surreptitious DNA. When if you just do the forensic genealogy, you'll find out it was the milkman.
Yeah, and I think one place where it may start to come into court more is search warrants, because I think, it's getting a search warrant, having genetic genealogy, which says we think it's this guy. You don't have to be sure. You don't have to have the STR to get a search warrant. You just need probable cause. And maybe you don't want to, take the time to get the CODIS hit or the STR hit or whatever, because you have to move quickly, and you know that evidence could be destroyed, but what you have is genetic genealogy. I think that's where you may start to see, once they start using it in active cases, that's where you're going to see it sort of play out in court, because defense attorneys are going to challenge it on the basis of, this isn't real science. The probable cause wasn't actually there. You shouldn't have issued the search warrant. Therefore, everything in the search warrant should be suppressed. And you kind of saw a little bit of that. We're talking about the Idaho case, where if you look at the search warrant, people didn't really understand this, but I thought it was really fascinating. If you look at the search warrant, at one point in the affidavit, they add in DNA, but they specifically say, we don't need this for probable cause. So go ahead and find this for all the other reasons we've said, but don't find it for this in case that this is eventually found to not be admissible, which I thought was really fascinating.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I think it'll be interesting to see how all this plays out in the future.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I know that there's a sort of feeling among the forensic genealogy experts, the community, that this should not be in search warrants. It shouldn't be in court records. It should be a totally behind the scenes, because again, it's not the point, right? It's a means to an end, just like a Crime Stoppers tip line. That's the way that these people who are using it view it. So it's going to be really interesting to see. I think you're right. I mean, is every police department going to have an internal forensic genealogist who's like, I'm on it, and like the cases are solved in 2 days, right? I mean,
right. Well, and that's, I think no is the answer to that question. I think what you're going to see is more police departments aligning with private entities that are doing this work. And we keep bringing up the Idaho case, but it's a case that should be brought up. There are people already speculating about the extent to which some of the DNA testing in that case was done by a private laboratory, and should that matter? And the answer is no. As long as the protocols are good and they're ensuring no contamination, it frankly may be better than a lot of the state labs. And I think you're going to see more and more of that, particularly in the genetic genealogy thing, because it is so new and it's so specialized, and it is that sort of two-step thing. It's not just you have somebody who analyzes the DNA and then compares it to what they get out of CODIS. I mean, it's a much more sort of complicated way. And so I get that people don't want that to happen. They want it to be behind the scenes, but I don't know that it's going to be able to stay behind the scenes much longer. I think it's going to, especially with these hot cases, it's going to become more and more at the forefront.
Well, and I think that's the push to protect the matches. I do think that will happen. I think that there's going to be, because right now, again, there's no regulation, right? So, if I submit a FOIA request to Florida and they give me all the documents, sometimes I get them with like the match names in them, right? I don't publish them because I'm ethical and I would not do that. But it's a little bit of the Wild West, right? And so I do think there's going to be some regulation or standards. And that's another thing with the labs, like you were saying. So the state labs do not do this work. They don't generate the SNP profiles that are needed to run the forensic genealogy. Those are private labs. And are they accredited, or what is accredited? So are those standards going to matter eventually? And this is all such an emerging process. And if you think about it, I mean, Golden State was 2018, it's 2023. This is 5 years. That's what we're talking. And I think somebody said 550 of these cases have now been resolved this way. That's a crazy rate, right? I mean, So it's snowballing, and it is going to at some point have to be addressed with some kind of like accepted standards.
I'll say this: I don't think you're going to run out of material anytime soon in cases
No.
to cover that are being resolved by this. Well, it's stunning to me that we've been talking. I mean, it's not surprising to me that we've been talking for an hour because it's been so fascinating, and I could talk about this forever. But I want to be respectful of your time. Obviously, if you're out there listening to this and you're not listening to DNA ID, you should be. Go listen to it, follow it, listen to these cases. Fascinating. It's the best podcast out there. You guys should be listening to it. But as we wrap up tonight, is there any last words of wisdom you want to share with our listeners before we sign off?
No, I mean, I personally encourage my listeners to, do their own DNA testing. First of all, it's fascinating from a personal standpoint, right? For example, I got an email from 23andMe the other day that said, your latest research data is in, you are afraid of heights. That's what the email was telling me, that my DNA says that I'm probably more likely than not afraid of heights. Well, guess what? I am terrified of heights. Like we went to the Eiffel Tower and I wouldn't look over. Okay. Like my husband still teases me about that. So,
That's kind of
it's
scary.
fascinating. It is a little, I mean, so that's why people find it a little scary, but it's your genetic makeup. Like you should know about it. You should take an interest in it, take an ownership. And so if you're going to submit it to an open source database, do so, with the hope and knowledge that not only are you helping solve crimes, which can bring closure to people that you know and you love, but you're identifying unidentified persons out there, which that is a whole nother thing that we didn't even get into, right? I mean, the number of does in this country, unidentified bodies lying in morgues who belong to somebody, right? And I did start a new little component of the show, Doe IDs, because they're like the boy in the box. They know who he is now. Did you see his new headstone? It's incredible. And he was literally discarded in a cardboard box, a 4-year-old boy. So it's really a powerful thing, and you're doing good by contributing. And this isn't going away. So you might as well, embrace it and go for the ride.
And every now and then I see people say things like, well, if I do that, and I might feel bad if like my brother or something's caught in a crime. It's always like your fifth cousin 5 times removed.
Yeah.
So don't worry about it. You won't know the person. Go ahead and
No.
submit your DNA to these things and help solve a case. And that's a really important point. Help give somebody their name back, because I don't know. I think that's really important. I think it's really important that a victim have their name and that we know who they are. And if they have family, that they learn what happened to somebody. I mean, there are holes in people's hearts that have been there for a very long time, and this technology is filling those. Well, look, I am just so thankful for you for joining us and talking for so long. I really appreciate it. I can't say thank you enough, both for coming on and for the work that you're doing and getting this out there, because I think it's really important, and I hope people will listen to your show. But I think that's all I have for today. I'm going to ask for your help. I always need your help when we're signing off, because I can't do it by myself, and I don't have Alice to help me.
No.
We'll be back next week with new interesting legal questions here on Prosecutors Legal Briefs. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Jessica.
And this has been the Prosecutors Legal Briefs. Started.
Got it. Okay, let me hit go on it here. There we go. I have to consent.
Okay. Oh, there you go. Well, I'm glad.
Yeah.
That we got that out of the way. Okay. You ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay. Are you going to be at CrimeCon this year?
You bet. I'm going to be on Podcast Row. I'll be there.
Awesome. Well, I can't wait to meet you in person then.
I know. I'll see you there. Florida.
All right. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. Have a good night.
You too. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.